At dawn on April 16, 1945, the destroyer USS Laffey maintained her lonely vigil at Radar Picket Station No. 1, roughly 30 miles northwest of Okinawa, a position notorious among sailors for being the most dangerous assignment in the Pacific Theater. At 07:27, Quartermaster Second Class Aristides Foutritis, a 19-year-old from a Greek Orthodox family in Seattle, lifted his pencil from the logbook as a sharp call from the radar shack broke the morning routine. A single, unidentified aircraft had appeared on the northern edge of the scope, 12 miles distant, moving at roughly 180 knots, flying at about 4,000 feet. Foutritis reached instinctively for the sound-powered phone. He did not yet know that this solitary radar trace would open the curtain on what would become the most ferocious kamikaze assault any U.S. warship would endure in the entire Second World War. Within the next hour and 20 minutes, the Laffey, an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer displacing about 2,200 tons, would confront 22 Japanese aircraft, a scale of attack that would puzzle naval analysts for decades. This onslaught was part of the Japanese High Command's massive Kikusui floating chrysanthemum operations, a sequence of coordinated suicide strikes launched in desperation as American forces closed in on Japan's final defensive perimeter. More than 3,000 aircraft had been committed to these missions, each conceived as a modern echo of the 14th century warrior Kusunoki Masashige, whose emblem, the chrysanthemum, symbolized dying faithfully for one's homeland rather than accepting defeat. By the time Laffey faced her ordeal, 7 major Kikusui waves had already swept across the American fleet off Okinawa. The toll was staggering. Hundreds of ships damaged, scores lost entirely, and countless sailors dead or wounded. Yet none of those earlier attacks would match the concentration and intensity of the assault converging on Laffey this morning. On the bridge, Commander Frederick Julian Beckton studied the tactical situation with practiced discipline. His ship carried 336 officers and enlisted men, along with a formidable array of anti-aircraft weaponry. 6 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 12 40mm Bofors, and 11 20mm Oerlikons. But even with such firepower, the mathematics of survival were grim. Under typical circumstances, a destroyer might shoot down a tiny percentage of incoming aircraft, barely 2% in many documented engagements. Mass suicide attacks increased that probability dramatically, pushing hit rates to nearly 19%. And now the Laffey was about to be tested far beyond any statistical expectation. Beckton himself had already lived through the worst the Pacific could offer. As executive officer aboard the first USS Laffey, he had witnessed her destruction at Guadalcanal in November 1942, when she exchanged point-blank gunfire as close as 20 feet with a Japanese battleship before being reduced to wreckage by 14-inch shells. Only months later, as captain of the destroyer USS Aaron Ward, he again saw his ship battered and sunk by concentrated Japanese air attacks. For some in the Navy, giving him command of the second Laffey seemed almost symbolic, either fate tempting him once more, or destiny aligning him with the crew most in need of his experience. Under his strict and relentless training, the Laffey's gunnery teams became some of the most precise in the Pacific Fleet. On this day, they would need every measure of that skill. Meanwhile, in the cockpit of a D-3A Val dive bomber approaching the American perimeter, a Japanese pilot checked his instruments one last time. His aircraft carried a 750-kilogram bomb, armed and ready. Officially, he had been sent on a reconnaissance sweep to determine fleet locations and report them back to command, but like countless young men of the Special Attack Corps, he had no intention of returning. He had written his final letters to his family, drowned his ceremonial cup of sake, and tied the hachimaki headband across his brow, a declaration that his life now belonged fully to the emperor. Whatever intelligence he was supposed to collect would never be delivered. His path, like that of so many of his comrades, was a direct, irreversible descent toward an American deck. American radar teams had been tracking the lone Val dive bomber as it circled irritably beyond the destroyer's effective firing envelope, roughly 8,000 yards out. Deep inside the Combat Information Center, Lieutenant Lloyd Hull monitored the ship's sophisticated radar suite, the long-range SK set capable of spotting aircraft at distances up to 60 miles, and the SG Surface Search Radar, which could identify ships at more than 20 miles. These electronic systems gave Laffey remarkable awareness, yet they were not flawless. Aircraft that stayed low to the water could evade the beams entirely, and large coordinated strikes often saturated operators with more contacts than they could manage at once. The newest Japanese tactic, sending high-altitude diversions to pull fighters away while low-level attackers slipped in, had already proven brutally effective. At 0730, the Val finally committed to an approach. Mount 51, armed with a 5-inch gun, pivoted to follow the target. Gunner's mate Lawrence Dosky had drilled his crew relentlessly. Under his direction, they could load, aim, and fire in less than 3 seconds. The Mark 37 fire control system linked to the mount used radar data to compute range, target angle, relative speed, wind drift, ship motion, and even barrel wear. This analog computer, an engineering marvel of its day, solved ballistic problems instantaneously, equations that would have taken human gunners minutes. But even with that assistance, striking a fast, maneuvering aircraft at 200 miles per hour was nearly as dependent on timing and luck as on precision. At 0744, the attacker broke off without dropping a bomb. Whether it had been testing defenses or whether its pilot simply abandoned the run remains unknown. What was clear on radar, however, was that the isolated contact was only the prelude. More returns were appearing in dense clusters. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding Japan's 5th Air Fleet on Kyushu, had ordered the launch of more than 350 aircraft for Kikusui No. 3. Their primary objectives were the radar picket destroyers, providing early warning for the main U.S. fleet. Neutralizing those outlying ships would leave the American carrier groups dangerously exposed. Because Laffey occupied Picket Station No. 1, one of the most vulnerable and strategically vital positions, it inevitably became a prime target. At 0727, Laffey's radar operators reported large formations closing from the north and northwest, well over 50 aircraft. Commander Frederick Beckton immediately requested assistance from the Combat Air Patrol. 4 F-6F Hellcats and 2 F-4U Corsairs were directed toward the threat, but they were 12 miles away and would require critical minutes to arrive. The 2 fighters assigned specifically to protect Laffey had lost radio contact and were unaccounted for. The destroyer would have to endure the opening blow without air cover. The first attackers arrived moments later. 4 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers approached in a coordinated pattern refined over years of Pacific warfare. 2 planes angled in from the bow, intending to force the destroyer into a turn that would expose its flank. The remaining pair positioned themselves astern, ready to exploit the maneuver. This attack technique, shaped by the experience and sacrifice of countless pilots, had become a brutal but efficient method for overwhelming American defensive fire. At 0830, the 4 aircraft divided into 2 pairs and began their runs. Beckton ordered maximum speed and a hard turn to port. Laffey leaned heavily into the maneuver, its hull creaking under the rapid change of direction. The evasive turn narrowed the destroyer's profile and brought additional guns to bear. But it also locked the ship onto a predictable course for several critical seconds, seconds in which the attackers closed rapidly. The first guns to speak were the forward dual-purpose mounts, turrets 51 and 52, whose 5-inch 38 barrels sent their opening salvos downrange. The sharp, concussive reports of the big guns rolled across the sea surface, followed moments later by the distant blossoms of airbursts. Each shell carried a mechanically timed fuse meant to explode at a precise point along its trajectory, producing a sphere of high-velocity fragments engineered to tear through aircraft skin, sever control cables, and wound or kill any pilot caught in the blast. Success depended entirely on predicting the correct moment of detonation. A fraction of a second too soon or too late rendered the round ineffective. In the forward fire control station, Fire Controlman Second Class Glenn Rodder observed the first enemy dive bomber, one of the Vols, closing rapidly on the starboard bow. As it crossed the 2,000-yard line, the ship's intermediate caliber weapons joined the defense. The 40mm Bofors mounts, Swedish in origin but produced in huge numbers by American factories, spat out 2-pound shells at a rate that seemed impossible to sustain. Their staccato thumping, layered atop the thunder of the 5-inch guns, produced a roar so overwhelming that gun crews abandoned verbal commands entirely, relying instead on gestures and prearranged signals. When the attacker reached roughly 1,000 yards, the smallest anti-aircraft weapons, the 20mm Ehrlichons, opened fire. These quick-firing cannons, Swiss in design but produced in huge numbers by American factories, poured streams of high-velocity rounds into the sky at several hundred shots per minute. Gunner's mate Third Class Warren Walker braced himself behind his Ehrlichon, his body strapped tightly into the mount, and squeezed the trigger. His tracer rounds reached out toward the oncoming aircraft, which, despite traveling at more than 200 miles per hour, seemed to crawl toward the ship with agonizing deliberateness. Walker later recalled seeing the pilot's silhouette, the markings on the wings, even the bombs slung beneath the fuselage. The first Vol absorbed multiple 40mm hits in quick succession. Panels of aluminum peeled away, and a section of the port wing tore off entirely. The wrecked plane tumbled toward the water, striking the sea a few hundred yards off the starboard beam. Its bomb detonated on impact, sending a towering plume of spray over the destroyer's forward mounts. One attacker eliminated. A second Vol approached from the port bow, flying into an especially dense volley from turret 52. A well-timed 5-inch airburst erupted directly beneath the aircraft, shredding its lower fuselage and instantly killing the pilot. The bomber plunged into the sea roughly 300 yards out. A third attacker swung in from astern and managed to release its bomb at about 500 yards, but repeated hits from the 20mm guns set it burning. Its bomb splashed harmlessly into the wake as the dying plane fell in behind the ship. A fourth Vol, approaching on a steady course that simplified the gunnery solution, encountered the concentrated fire of the aft 5-inch mount, turret 53, commanded by Chief Gunner's Mate Wayne Schaefer. 3 direct hits tore the bomber apart in mid-air, scattering wreckage across the surface. In barely 3 minutes, 4 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. Inside the Combat Information Center, Lieutenant Hull chalked the kills onto his plotting board, but the radar screen offered no relief. More attackers were inbound. The 8-plane combat air patrol that should have been overhead had been diverted by decoy fighters, and the 2-plane low-altitude section remained out of radio contact. For the moment, the destroyer stood alone. At 0839, the main assault group arrived. Unlike the earlier, more coordinated dive-bombing runs, this wave attacked in chaotic, rapid sequence from multiple directions. The tactic, designed after careful analysis of U.S. anti-aircraft procedure, aimed to overwhelm the limitations of human operators. Directors could follow only a single target at a time. Hand-crank gun mounts required seconds to shift orientation. Ammunition crews, even when working at full speed, could sustain peak output only briefly before fatigue set in. The fifth attacker, a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy, raced in from dead ahead at barely above the water, far too low for the 5-inch guns to depress. Captain Becton ordered full power and a hard right turn in an attempt to bring the aft batteries to bear. The forward 20mm gunners fired non-stop at the skim-level bomber, their tracers fanning out like a luminous net. The Judy pressed on despite absorbing multiple hits. At scarcely 100 yards, the pilot hauled back on the stick, seemingly intent on ramming the bridge. On the port bridge wing, Quartermaster Fuchs watched as the spinning propeller dominated his entire view. A moment later, the damaged aircraft stalled, whether from pilot miscalculation or accumulated battle damage could never be determined. It clipped the port yardarm, whipped around violently, and struck the water only a few dozen yards away. The explosion drenched the bridge in flaming fuel and shards of metal. Fuchs flattened himself against the bulkhead, feeling the searing heat wash over him. Barely seconds passed before the next danger appeared. The sixth attacker, another Judy, swept in from the starboard quarter on a vector that hid it from most of the ship's guns. Only turret 53 and the rear 40mm mount were able to engage. The bomber dropped its ordnance at about 300 yards. Becton ordered a hard turn to port, but the maneuver came too late. The bomb pierced the main deck between the smokestacks and detonated in the aft crew compartments, killing 2 men instantly and igniting fires dangerously close to stored ammunition. Then the seventh attacker, a Val approaching from the port side, charged straight into a dense curtain of 20mm fire. Seaman First Class Robert Carr, stationed at gun mount 23, kept his finger on the trigger even as the barrel overheated to the edge of failure. The continuous stream of fire finally caught the oncoming Aichi D-3A Val. Flames burst from the aircraft's engine, and the dive bomber smashed into the sea close along the port side. Burning aviation fuel splashed across Laffey's deck, igniting fresh fires that damage control parties scrambled to contain. The eighth hostile aircraft approached under complete concealment. A Nakajima B-5N Kate, loaded with bombs instead of torpedoes, crept in from the stern, hidden by the drifting smoke left by earlier attackers. The plane was nearly upon the destroyer before anyone caught sight of it. Gunner's mate Calvin Clough, operating a 40mm mount, attempted to swing his gun into position, but the traverse rate simply could not match the Kate's closing speed. At 0842, the bomber slammed directly into Mount 53, the after 5-inch gun turret. The consequences were devastating. The Kate's 250-kilogram bomb exploded instantly on impact, shearing away the turret's upper structure and killing Chief Schaefer and the entire crew inside. Burning fuel cascaded through the battered turret opening into the handling rooms below. Ready ammunition began detonating from the heat, sending 5-inch shells ricocheting across the fantail. One shell tore through the deck plates and burst in the steering gear compartment, locking the rudder at 26 degrees to port. With her rudder jammed and engines still at speed, Laffey fell into an uncontrolled left-hand circle at almost 25 knots. Captain Becton ordered the engines secured at once, but inertia carried the ship around in another full rotation before she slowed. The loss of steering occurred at the worst possible moment. A new wave of attackers was already beginning its approach. The ninth aircraft, another Val, came in from the starboard beam. The destroyer's defensive fire had been severely reduced. Mount 53 was gone, crews were fighting fires, and the ship was still limping in a slow circle. Although the Val absorbed multiple 40mm hits, it pressed its attack. Only at the final moment did concentrated 20mm fire sever its control surfaces. The bomber flipped inverted and plunged into the sea only a few yards away. Its bomb detonated underwater, lifting Laffey's stern clear of the surface in a violent shock. The 10th attacker, a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy, nearly ended the fight altogether. It approached from astern, where the destroyed after turret could no longer provide any defense. With the rudder frozen and maneuverability gone, Becton could not swing the ship to bring remaining guns to bear. At roughly 200 yards, the Judy released its bomb. The weapon tore into the fantail, carving an 8 by 10 foot gap in the deck and killing 6 men at the after 20mm mounts. Among those lost was signalman Bill Kelly, who had been attempting to jury-rig an emergency steering system. The time was 0845. In just 13 minutes, Laffey had endured 2 direct bomb hits and 1 suicide impact. 6 more aircraft had been destroyed within sight of the ship, yet the attack showed no sign of ending. Radar operators reported additional contacts inbound. The destroyer's fighting strength was deteriorating rapidly. Mount 53 lay in ruins, steering was gone, fires raged in multiple compartments, ammunition stocks at several gun positions were running low, and casualties were rising. The tally already stood at 15 dead and 26 wounded. The 11th attacker signaled a rare moment of relief. Approaching from the port bow, the Val began its dive just as 4 Marine F-4U Corsairs from Marine Fighter Squadron 441, flying out of Yontan Airfield on Okinawa, thundered onto the scene. Captain Robert Klingman closed on the Val at roughly 500 feet and opened fire. His 50-caliber guns tore apart the bomber's tail assembly, sending it spiraling into the sea. It was the first attacking aircraft Laffey did not have to shoot down herself. Still, the Marine fighters could not cover every direction at once. The 12th attacker, a Judy, coming in from the starboard quarter, slipped through while the Corsairs were engaged elsewhere. This kamikaze found its mark. At 0847, the aircraft crashed into the after deckhouse between the stacks. Its bomb punched through the deck and detonated in the after engine room. The explosion ruptured steam lines, releasing superheated vapor nearly 600 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the compartment. The aftermath of the latest strike inside the destroyer's engineering spaces was catastrophic. In the aft engine compartment, machinist's mate George Logan and 3 of his shipmates were subjected to heat so intense that they were effectively burned alive where they stood. The force of the explosion crippled the after-fire room, instantly reducing the destroyer's ability to maneuver. With steam pressure collapsing, the Laffey's top speed dropped to about 12 knots, a dangerously slow pace for a ship being swarmed by suicide aircraft. Up forward, Chief Machinist's mate George Weiss felt the ship lurch violently as the blast reached him. Years of experience told him exactly what had happened. The sudden plunge in steam pressure meant the after-engine room was no longer functioning. Temperatures in the forward machinery spaces soared well above 130 degrees Fahrenheit, but despite the oppressive heat and choking smoke, Weiss and his team worked frantically to keep the boilers alive. They understood with absolute clarity that if the Laffey lost propulsion entirely, she would become an immobile target, easy prey for the waves of attackers still closing in. Every valve, every gauge, every line of steam mattered in that moment of survival. The 13th enemy aircraft appeared almost without warning, a Yokosuka PY-1 Francis twin-engine bomber racing in from directly astern. With Mount 53 already annihilated and most of the aft 20mm mounts destroyed, the destroyer had almost no remaining firepower capable of defending the rear sector. The Francis pilot pressed in at high speed, clearly intending to crash into the bridge, where a single hit could decapitate the ship's command structure. Then, in an instant, help arrived from above. A Marine F-4U Corsair flown by Lieutenant Richard Kerstetter dove steeply and raked the bomber with a long burst of gunfire. The Francis veered sharply right, out of control, and skimmed past the Laffey's stern by fewer than 10 feet before plowing into the sea. The 14th attacker, an Oscar fighter, came even closer to success. It approached from the port side at maximum speed, so fast that the destroyer's directors struggled to maintain a firing solution. Mount 51 managed to fire 3 shells, but all missed. The Oscar's pilot aimed straight for the bridge, another attempt to eliminate the Laffey's leadership in a single blow. At the final moment, gunners made second-class Robert Fenwick, operating a portside 40mm Bofors, fired a burst that struck the aircraft's tail assembly. The fighter yawed abruptly left, its wing smashing into the ship's mast and severing the port yardarm along with the American flag. The crippled aircraft then crashed into the water just off the port side.
For a few fleeting minutes, ending around 0848, the sky suddenly emptied. No aircraft were visible, though radar operators reported additional contacts forming to the north. Commander Becton used the pause to gather damage reports. What he heard was bleak. Mount 53 completely destroyed, its entire crew lost. Steering no longer functional due to flooding in the after-engine room. Multiple uncontrolled fires. At least 32 dead and more than 50 injured. Several gun positions dangerously low on ammunition. And more enemy aircraft were still on the way. Standing nearby on the bridge, Lieutenant Frank Manson, the communications officer, asked the question that many on board were thinking. Should preparations begin to abandon ship? Becton's reply would be repeated for decades afterward. Absolutely not, Frank. We still have weapons that can fire. I will not abandon this ship while a single gun can still be brought to bear." A lookout, hearing the exchange, muttered his own quiet addition, "And if there's one man left to fire it." The 15th attacker interrupted the brief lull. A Val dive bomber descending almost vertically out of the blinding morning sun. The angle made it nearly invisible until the final seconds of its attack run. The Val released its bomb from roughly 1,000 feet. Becton reflexively ordered a hard turn to starboard, only to remember a moment later that the steering gear had been destroyed. The bomb splashed into the sea a few yards off the port side, its detonation peppering the hull with shrapnel and injuring 4 more crewmen. The 16th aircraft was far larger. A Mitsubishi G4M Betty Bonner sweeping in low from the starboard side at barely 200 feet of altitude, too low for the ship's 5-inch guns to engage effectively. Every 20mm and 40mm mount that could bear on the target opened fire, streams of tracers stitching across the sky into the bomber's fuselage and wings. The Betty absorbed hit after hit. First one engine caught fire, then the second erupted as well. Despite the flames engulfing nearly the entire aircraft, the pilot held his course. At about 300 yards, he released 2 bombs that landed on either side of the ship, missing but bracketing the ship. Even burning uncontrollably, the pilot continued his desperate charge toward the Laffey, until in the final seconds, the aircraft's left wing dipped downward. What happened to the next Japanese bomber would never be fully understood. Whether the pilot had been killed mid-approach or the aircraft simply became uncontrollable, the Betty swept directly over Mount 52 so closely that the 5-inch gun crew instinctively threw themselves flat. A heartbeat later, the bomber plunged into the sea off the port side, skipping across the surface and flaming fragments that ricocheted like burning debris hurled across a black mirror. Yet the following attacker succeeded where all earlier efforts had failed. The 17th aircraft, an Oscar fighter diving in at high speed from ahead, released a bomb that struck Mount 52 with perfect accuracy. Although the turret's armor prevented the blast from penetrating, the shock wave inside the mount killed 3 sailors instantly and wounded 5 others, including the mount's commanding petty officer. The turret fell silent, effectively halving Laffey's forward artillery capability. By 0850, the destroyer was nearing the limits of survival. The only fully functional 5-inch mount left was Mount 51. Half of the 40mm weapons had been destroyed or disabled. Most of the 20mm guns were no longer operable. Fires raged unchecked throughout the ship. With the rudder jammed, Laffey could only make 8 knots in a slow, helpless circle, while radar screens continued to show fresh waves of attackers closing in. The 18th attacker should have ended the battle. A lone Val approached from directly astern, one of the few angles where Laffey had virtually no remaining guns able to respond. But before the bomber could commit to its dive, 2 Marine F-4U Corsairs suddenly dropped out of the sky. Captain Floyd Kirkpatrick and Lieutenant Robert Cowan intercepted the Val at point-blank range, their combined .5 caliber gunfire tearing the aircraft apart in mid-air. The explosion occurred so close aboard that pieces of the shattered bomber rained onto Laffey's deck. Exhausted and nearly out of ammunition, Laffey's gunners then faced the 21st attacker, a Judy coming in fast from the port quarter. Many of the crew had been firing without pause for more than 20 minutes. Gun barrels glowed from heat. Several weapons had seized from overuse. Still, the Judy pressed forward despite the rounds striking its wings and fuselage. At barely 100 yards, the pilot tried to angle upward and crashed directly into the bridge. A burst from Mount 44 clipped the bomber's wing root, sending it rolling violently to the right before it slammed into the sea only a few yards away. At 0851, the 20th attacker, another Val, made its run from starboard. This pilot, having witnessed the death of several comrades, varied his altitude and heading constantly, weaving in an effort to confuse the remaining gun crews. Laffey's surviving weapons fired frantically, but battle fatigue and mounting damage impaired accuracy. The Val released its bomb at roughly 300 yards. It struck the water alongside the ship, detonating with a force that peppered the already battered hull with more shrapnel. Then came the 21st aircraft, and it nearly succeeded where 20 others had not. Concealed by the thick smoke pouring from Laffey's midships, a Judy slipped in from astern without appearing on radar or being spotted by lookouts. The first sign of its presence was the deafening roar of its engine as it streaked only 50 feet above the fantail. The pilot dropped his bomb at virtually point-blank range. The weapon penetrated the deck forward of the destroyed Mount 53, burrowing into the after ammunition handling compartment before detonating.
The result was devastating. The blast set off 5-inch shells in a deadly chain of sympathetic explosions. The aft section of the ship erupted in fire, smoke, and fragmentation. Damaged control parties rushing to contain the flames were torn apart by flying metal. Among those killed was Ensign Robert Thompson, who had abandoned his duties in the Combat Information Center to help direct repairs. His actions would later earn him a posthumous Navy Cross. The explosion also shattered the ship's firefighting mains, eliminating water pressure throughout the aft section. Without hoses, sailors resorted to the most primitive methods imaginable, throwing blazing debris overboard with their bare, heavily wrapped hands. Some grabbed red-hot shell casings and hurled them off the deck. Others rolled across the steel plating to extinguish the flames consuming their own clothing. Through smoke, fire, wounds, and exhaustion, Laffey's crew continued to fight for their ship with little more than desperation and willpower left. At 08:53, the last of the attackers, a dive bomber of the Val type, closed in from the destroyer's port bow. By then, USS Laffey was scarcely capable of meaningful resistance. Every major battery except Mount 51, along with the few surviving light caliber guns, had either been knocked out or cut off by fire and flooding. The ship was no longer moving under her own power. Heavy smoke poured from multiple ruptured compartments, and she leaned steadily to port as seawater continued to invade the hull. Commander F. Julian Beckton watched the incoming aircraft with the grim understanding that his vessel had almost nothing left to fight with. But the destroyer was no longer standing alone. 4 F-6F Hellcats from Fighter Squadron 10, launched from the carrier Intrepid and delayed until this moment, arrived just as the Val committed to its run. At roughly 1,000 yards, Lieutenant John Mitchell opened fire, sending a concentrated stream of machine gun rounds directly into the dive bomber's engine block. The aircraft ignited instantly, broke apart, and struck the sea only moments later, roughly 500 yards short of Laffey. With its impact, the extraordinary sequence of attacks finally ended. Over a span of 80 minutes, the destroyer had been subjected to what would later be described as the most intense, sustained kamikaze assault endured by any single Allied ship in the Pacific theater. 22 enemy aircraft had targeted her. 6 of those aircraft had smashed into the destroyer or hit her with bombs. She had been raked by strafing runs, rocked by explosions, and engulfed in multiple fires. Yet despite the devastation that seemed certain to doom her, the ship remained afloat, battered, burning, barely stable, but alive. The cost was severe: 32 crew members killed and 71 wounded. Laffey herself was a near ruin, her decks torn open and her interior ravaged by both flame and flooding. But against all expected calculations, she did not sink. When the action was later analyzed, the damage and casualty numbers were overshadowed by the statistics of the engagement itself. Of the 22 hostile aircraft, Laffey's defensive weapons alone accounted for 8 confirmed shootdowns. Navy and Marine fighters accounted for another 8. The remaining 6 made direct strikes or scored hits with bombs. No other surface ship in recorded naval combat encountered such a densely concentrated series of suicide attacks and survived. Mathematical modeling conducted after the war suggested that the probability of a destroyer enduring such an assault without sinking was below 1%. Lieutenant Commander Charles Holbrook, the ship's executive officer, later broke the battle down with near-scientific precision. The average gap between enemy approaches measured 3 minutes and 38 seconds. The longest pause lasted 8 minutes. The shortest interval was only 45 seconds. At the height of the offensive, Laffey was forced to respond to a new attacker roughly 90 seconds, and this pattern repeated for nearly a quarter of an hour. No other vessel in naval records had ever faced an equivalent tempo of incoming threats and remained afloat. Technology played a crucial role. The Mark 37 fire control system, with its mechanically driven analog computers, allowed the 5-inch 38 caliber guns to engage rapidly maneuvering aircraft with remarkable precision. The presence of proximity-fused ammunition, still relatively new and closely guarded at the time, multiplied the likelihood of destructive near misses. The 40mm Bofors mounts, firing explosive shells at a high cyclic rate, formed a vital mid-range barrier. Even the much-criticized 20mm Oerlikon guns, widely considered outdated by 1945, proved decisive at very short distances, downing several aircraft approaching in their final seconds. Yet the technical advantages alone could not account for Laffey's survival. Human performance under extreme duress was the determining factor. Commander Beckton, ability to command a maneuvering, burning vessel while under continuous attack, was later cited as exemplary. Gun crews kept their stations even as fires swept across decks and the ship shuddered under repeated impacts. Damage control parties battled flames with improvised equipment when hoses failed. Engineering personnel, choking in smoke-filled compartments, maintained what little power the ship had left. Radar operators attempted to track multiple incoming aircraft despite interference from fire, debris, and the ship's own smoke. At every critical moment, sailors remained at their posts when retreating for safety would have been an understandable instinct. The attacking force was composed of Japan's most skilled surviving aviators. These were not the minimally trained late-war volunteers who were often given only rudimentary instruction. Many of the pilots who struck Laffey were veterans who chose deliberate, fatal attacks as an expression of their final loyalty. Their coordination, especially during the opening phase of the assault, demonstrated deep familiarity with American shipboard defenses and reflected a level of tactical planning that surpassed most late-war kamikaze operations. The Japanese assault on Laffey demonstrated several tactical methods that would later be examined in detail by naval analysts. The exploitation of glare and smoke to mask approach routes, the use of simultaneous attacks from multiple directions to strain a ship's fire control systems, and the deliberate targeting of command and communication centers to cripple coordination. These techniques, once merely observations from the battlefield, would eventually influence the post-war evolution of naval aviation doctrine. In the immediate aftermath, the tactical consequences were felt across the broader Okinawa defensive grid. When Laffey was forced out of Radar Picket Station No. 1, a noticeable void opened in the early warning chain that shielded the invasion force. Yet her survival conveyed an even stronger strategic signal. The fact that a single destroyer had endured 22 suicide-driven assaults and remained afloat called into question the entire premise of Japan's kamikaze strategy.
The arithmetic that Japanese planners had once believed favorable, sacrificing large numbers of aircraft and pilots to destroy a relatively small number of Allied warships, was collapsing under the weight of American anti-aircraft firepower and highly developed damage control practices. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who commanded amphibious operations at Okinawa, later emphasized the psychological importance of Laffey's escape. According to Turner, the ship's endurance did more to sustain fleet morale during the height of the kamikaze onslaught than any other single event. If Laffey could withstand such a massive coordinated strike and still fight on, then no vessel in the fleet was beyond hope. This mattered deeply to sailors who increasingly viewed radar picket duty as a near-certain death assignment. Japanese reactions were equally revealing. Allied intelligence intercepts showed that the failure to sink Laffey, despite the unusually large number of attacking aircraft, had shaken the confidence of many special attack pilots. A nagging question took hold. If more than 20 aircraft could not dispatch one destroyer, what would it take to destroy a carrier or a battleship? The underlying math that had once justified the kamikaze concept, a single pilot and plane exchanged for a single enemy ship, no longer held up. Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, reviewing the after-action accounts, grasped the implications immediately. In his diary entry for April 16, he conceded that the destroyer's survival revealed the inherent limits of ramming attacks against well-defended targets. He wrote that Japan would need to rethink its approach, an extraordinary admission for a leader responsible for coordinating special attack operations. Within a matter of weeks, Japanese planners redirected their efforts toward less protected targets, such as transports and logistics vessels, an acknowledgement, though unstated, that the strategy had reached its breaking point. The engagement also produced rapid technological and doctrinal consequences for the United States. The Allen M. Sumner-class destroyers, including Laffey, with their twin 5-inch mounts and dense anti-aircraft armament, effectively became the blueprint for post-war surface combatants. The battle offered hard proof of the value of proximity-fused ammunition, which repeatedly disrupted attacking aircraft before they could reach their release points. It also reaffirmed the necessity of redundant firefighting and internal control systems that allowed the crew to contain damage even when multiple sections of the ship were in flames. Navies worldwide pored over Laffey's action reports in the months and years that followed. The lessons extracted from her ordeal, some technical, some tactical, many profoundly human, shaped doctrines far beyond the U.S. fleet. Yet perhaps her most enduring legacy lay in what the crew demonstrated under unrelenting attack. Even in an era increasingly defined by radar-guided weapons, mechanical fire control computers, and automated detection systems, human qualities, discipline, training, initiative, and sheer resolve remained decisive factors in survival. The same traits that had once allowed lightly armed ships to stand against ironclad opponents or had enabled improbable victories in far older battles still carried weight in the mid-20th century battle space.
Laffey's repair record underscored the scale of what she had endured. 4 months in dry dock were required to bring her back to serviceable condition. More than 300 tons of damaged plating and structural material were removed and replaced, and the entire aft portion of the vessel had to be essentially reconstructed. The cost of these repairs climbed to over $3 million, more than 1/3 of what it had taken to build the destroyer in the first place. Nonetheless, the Navy viewed the expenditure as fully justified, seeing Laffey not merely as a ship restored, but as a symbol of resilience vital to the fleet's fighting spirit. The ordeal of the USS Laffey ultimately demonstrated that an American destroyer, even when subjected to a level of violence no ship was built to endure, could remain afloat and fighting. Although the loss of life was painful and deeply felt, it was far from catastrophic given the scale of destruction inflicted on the vessel. Of the 336 men aboard, 32 were killed, fewer than 1 out of every 10 sailors, despite the destroyer absorbing 6 suicide crashes and 4 separate bomb hits. Analysts later attributed this remarkably low fatality rate to several converging factors. Captain Becton's relentless insistence on damage control readiness during training,
the battle-hardened experience accumulated by many crew members in earlier operations, the inherent structural resilience of the Allen M. Sumner-class destroyers, which incorporated stronger armor schemes and improved compartment layouts, and, above all, the relentless work of the ship's medical division under Lieutenant Commander Matthew Darnell, who continued treating casualties even as explosions shook the decks around him. The number of individual acts of courage recorded that day was so large that no single account can do justice to them all. Among the most notable was gunner's mate Lawrence Dowski, stationed at Mount 51, who refused to abandon his gun despite being struck by shrapnel early in the fighting. Remaining at his station, he was credited with bringing down 3 of the 8 enemy aircraft that fell to Laffey's guns. In the forward engine room, machinist's mate George Weiss worked in inferno-like heat, hot enough to blister paint and scorch metal fittings, yet he and his team managed to keep the forward turbines producing power, preventing the destroyer from being left adrift. Quartermaster Ari Futrides performed a quieter but historically invaluable task, maintaining the ship's log throughout the entire engagement. His steady documentation produced the chronological record that later allowed historians to reconstruct the battle with precision. Seaman Calvin Clough offered another example of the crew's resilience. After his entire 40mm gun crew was killed, he stepped in alone, firing the weapon until he succeeded in downing an attacking aircraft, continuing even after being seriously wounded. Perhaps the most dramatic individual action came from Lieutenant J.G. T.W.W. Runk, the damage control officer. Moving rapidly through smoke-filled compartments to assess the ship's condition, Runk discovered a 250-kilogram bomb that had penetrated the deck but had not detonated. Understanding immediately what was at stake, he lifted the device himself and hurled it over the side. It exploded only moments after hitting the water, close enough for fragments to slap against Laffey's hull. Had the weapon gone off on deck, the resulting blast would almost certainly have crippled the ship beyond hope. The destroyer was not alone in the fight. Other vessels stationed at Radar Picket Station No. 1 provided vital support during the most desperate moments. The landing craft support ship USS L-51, under Lieutenant Howell Sherritt, was credited with destroying 6 enemy aircraft and later received a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions. When Laffey's own gun batteries were being knocked out one by one, the suppressive fire from USS L-51 helped keep additional attackers at bay. Meanwhile, USS L-116 played a different but equally crucial role by rescuing 22 Laffey sailors who had been blown into the sea, many of them badly burned and suffering from shock. Their rapid recovery efforts prevented the casualty list from climbing even higher.
Air cover eventually reached the scene, and the pilots who arrived were instrumental in dispersing the remaining attackers. Among them, Marine Captain Floyd Kirkpatrick was credited with shooting down 3 aircraft, helping to relieve some of the pressure on the battered destroyer during the final phase of the assault. Navy Lieutenant John Mitchell managed to bring down 2 attackers himself. The arrival of his fighters and those of his fellow pilots occurred at the precise moment when Laffey's guns were nearly silent from exhaustion and damage. Their intervention, arriving within seconds of disaster, almost certainly prevented the destroyer from being lost. The absence of the originally assigned combat air patrol, which had been lured away by Japanese decoys, forced U.S. commanders to confront a hard truth. The existing system for directing fighters to radar picket ships was flawed. In the aftermath, doctrine was rewritten. Never again would a picket destroyer be left without uninterrupted, layered air coverage. The implications extended far beyond a single ship's survival. On April 16th, during the third Kikusui mass attack, Japan had launched more than 300 aircraft. Only 22 had succeeded in striking Laffey, and even then the damage inflicted, though severe, had not disabled the vessel. Japan's overall strength was estimated at roughly 3,000 operational aircraft. At the loss rate displayed that day, their air arm would be depleted long before they could seriously disrupt the Allied armada prepared for the coming invasion of the Japanese home islands. The arithmetic was merciless. Admiral Chester Nimitz studied the action report and ordered immediate reforms.
Picket ships would now operate in mutually reinforcing groups rather than as isolated targets. Fighter cover would be continuous, overlapping, and centrally coordinated. Auxiliary repair vessels were repositioned closer to the picket line to ensure rapid support. These adjustments, implemented rapidly, sharply reduced U.S. losses during the later Kikusui waves. Japan also analyzed the engagement, but the lessons they drew were grim. Concentrating so many kamikaze aircraft against a single ship had cost them irreplaceable pilots without producing the decisive results hoped for. Their planners shifted towards scattering attacks across multiple ships at once, attempting to dilute American defensive focus. Yet this very dispersal decreased the odds of crippling any one ship. It was a no-win dilemma. Admiral Seiichi Toyoda, commander of Japan's combined fleet, later acknowledged that the inability to destroy Laffey marked a symbolic breaking point in their strategy. The kamikaze forces had been Japan's final attempt to slow or halt the U.S. advance. If hundreds of aircraft could not eliminate a lone destroyer, then the prospects of halting Operation Downfall, the massive planned invasion, were effectively non-existent. The atomic bombings 4 months later merely accelerated a collapse that had already become inevitable.
The battle's longer-term impact reshaped naval warfare. Laffey's survival demonstrated conclusively that a surface vessel, if adequately armed, coordinated, and trained, could withstand large-scale air assaults. This revelation directly informed Cold War naval design. Modern warships, built around multi-layered air defense, computer-assisted tracking, and rapid-response missile systems, owe their conceptual ancestry to lessons learned off Okinawa. The Aegis combat system, engineered to track and engage numerous targets simultaneously, can trace part of its lineage to the technological and tactical challenges revealed that day. So too can the emphasis on point defense weapons, compartmentalization, and rigorous damage control protocols that define every major Navy ships today. The human legacy proved just as significant. Laffey's crew developed one of the most enduring veterans associations in U.S. naval history, meeting for decades after the war. Their adopted motto, "We Who Survived," reflected not only their physical endurance, but also the emotional weight carried by those who had stared into an onslaught few ships and fewer men ever lived to recount. In the decades after the war, many of the men who had fought for their lives aboard USS Laffey began to experience symptoms that would later be classified as post-traumatic stress disorder. The terminology did not exist in 1945, but the psychological after-effects were unmistakable. Modern Navy research into combat fatigue and long-term trauma has repeatedly drawn on the experiences of crews like Laffey's to understand how intense, prolonged combat impacts the human mind. Commander F. Julian Beckton, who had led the destroyer through its ordeal, continued his Navy career and eventually reached the rank of Rear Admiral. His decisions during the kamikaze onslaught were later dissected in classrooms at naval academies and war colleges around the world. When he published his memoir, The Ship That Would Not Die, it became mandatory reading for officer candidates at Annapolis. Yet Beckton never claimed the story as his own achievement. In a 1975 oral history interview, he emphasized that his crew deserved the real recognition. "I issued the commands, but they were the ones who executed them. They're the reason the ship lived. Any officer would have been honored to serve with men like that." Remarkably, the destroyer herself continued to operate for 3 more decades. Laffey served during the Korean War, participated in multiple Cold War patrols, and remained an active unit until her 1975 decommissioning. Unlike most destroyers of her era, which were quickly dismantled or sunk as gunnery targets, Laffey was spared. Instead, she was selected for preservation. Beginning in 1982, the ship took up permanent residence at Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in South Carolina. Visitors walking her decks today can still see several areas where battle scars were intentionally left untouched, including the shattered Mount 53 at the stern, kept unrestored in memory of the 6 sailors who died at their stations there. The question of how the destroyer survived an assault that should have overwhelmed her remains the subject of lively debate among naval historians. Some scholars argue that mathematical chance cannot fully explain her endurance and point to the improbability of the outcome as justification for attributing survival to fate or divine intervention. Others focus on more tangible factors, a chain of small tactical advantages, rapid decision-making, well-trained gunners, and mid-20th century technological innovations that collectively produced a result that, while statistically unlikely, was not impossible. The reality almost certainly reflects a combination of both perspectives. Combat at sea has always been a collision between disciplined preparation and the uncontrollable variables of battle. Probability alone rarely captures the entire picture.
What is indisputable is the level of valor displayed by everyone involved. The Japanese aviators committed to the attack represented some of the last highly skilled pilots available to the Empire. Many willingly chose a final mission they believed would serve their country. The American sailors resisting them were mostly young men in their teens or early 20s, abruptly placed in a struggle where survival depended on unwavering discipline under catastrophic pressure. On both sides of the Pacific, individuals displayed extraordinary bravery spent in a contest that destroyed lives and ships, but also revealed the capacity for courage in the midst of destruction. The tragedy of war lies in this paradox. The same qualities that inspire admiration are often expressed through acts meant to annihilate the enemy rather than build anything enduring. Shortly before dawn on 16 April 1945, USS Laffey was simply one more destroyer assigned to radar picket duty, a dangerous but routine task during the Okinawa campaign. By midday, she had become part of naval legend. Her endurance against 22 attacking aircraft cemented her place in history as the ship that would not die. Generations of sailors would later study her example as a demonstration of how discipline, technical skill, and sheer determination can push human performance beyond expected limits. The final notation made in Laffey's deck log that day was written by Quartermaster F.J. Futridis as the damaged destroyer struggled toward Karama Reto for emergency repairs. His entry was brief and almost clinical in tone. Quote, "Came under heavy enemy air attack. Ship sustained damage but remains operational, proceeding to base." End quote. Behind those restrained words were nearly an hour and a half of chaos, the deaths of 32 crew members, and one of the most extraordinary survival stories in naval warfare. Although the war would end only 4 months later, Japan's suicide tactics continued to inflict casualties through the final summer of the Pacific Campaign. Several Allied vessels would be sunk or badly damaged before hostilities ceased, but no single ship would ever again face the intensity or concentration of strikes that Laffey encountered on that April morning. The level of coordination shown by the Japanese that day was never replicated. Nor was the outcome ever again in question. Laffey's survival demonstrated that American destroyers, backed by improving tactics and increasing combat experience, could withstand even the most determined attempts to destroy them. Beyond its historical significance, Laffey's story carries enduring relevance. Modern strategy often emphasizes precision-guided missiles, electronic disruption, and high-impact attacks designed to disable major assets in moments. Yet the destroyer's experience serves as a reminder that wars are ultimately decided not only by advanced technology, but by the resilience, preparation, and resolve of the people who operate it. The ship's survival illustrates that statistically overwhelming threats can be resisted when training, adaptability, and human resolve come together at a critical moment. In the end, Laffey's ordeal underscores a broader truth. Mathematics can estimate risk, but it cannot fully determine outcome. Against forecasts that predicted certain destruction, the destroyer endured. The vessel that should not have remained afloat did exactly that, demonstrating that even in the most mechanized era of warfare, the human element still has the power to alter events that seem predetermined.